School Church. You might find that a kind of a weird name for a church to be called a new school church, but we'll talk about why that is once we get inside. What's special about this is the very first building that was moved here. The Northville Women's Club, who I happen to be president of this year, donated a brick in front of here. We were established in 1892. We were instrumental in having this building moved here because it was Northville's first library after it was a church. And when they wanted to demolish it, the Women's Club said, "Oh, we can't. This is so historical. We need to save this building." So really that was the beginning of how this village came about. And they did help save the building, and they donated it to the village, and then the village expanded from there. So let's go inside and talk a little bit about this church. This church, was built in 1845. The people who started this church were actually part of the First Presbyterian Church, which is still here in Northville. It's the one with the pretty white steeple right next to the Starbucks in town, still very active. But back in the mid-1800s, you might recall from history that there was a lot going on in our country. The abolition movement was starting, and some people supported abolishing slavery, but other people were sympathetic to the plantation owners and realized that, oh, they might need those slaves. Why do we want to abolish this? They're producing our cotton, they're producing our sugar, they're producing our tobacco. So there was a real division in the country over whether slavery should be abolished or not. The people who started this this church had a new school of thought. The people at the Presbyterian Church, they had very strict rules. They had to keep the Sabbath holy on Sunday, no work on Sunday, no drinking. It was just a very strict environment. And the people didn't really like that. They wanted a little bit more freedom, but also that issue of slavery came up. And the ones who started this church really felt very strongly about abolishing slavery. So since they had their new school of thought compared to the other Presbyterians, they decided to start this church. The thing was, this church was only in existence for about 4 or 5 years, I believe, because it was too expensive to pay a minister. So then it was closed, and actually by that time, the other Presbyterians kind of came around to the idea of abolishing slavery, so they didn't really have to have their own church anymore. So then what happened to this church after that? Well, it was used as Northville's first library. So you can imagine big shelves here and stacks of books. It was also used as a Board of Education building for a while. I think it was used as a Salvation Army barracks for a while. So it was used as a lot of different things. Today it's here. People can rent this building. A lot of people rent it for weddings. My son did his Eagle Court of Honor here. It was pretty important to him. And, so you could rent it for ceremonies like that too. So it's nice that we have this available to our families here. This building, let's talk about it a little bit. I am talking in a very normal voice right now. I'm not raising my voice at all. I do not have a megaphone or a microphone of any kind. Of course, there were no electric microphones back then. But when they built this, they had the acoustics in mind for the minister to be able to stand up in front and talk to his congregation, and they should be able to hear him. So they built the very high ceiling that allow for the acoustics to work, so you can hear my voice even though I'm just talking in a very normal voice. And again, like we talked about in the school, they have really long, tall windows to allow a lot of light in, because like we said, there was no electricity for lights back then. So the big tall windows allow plenty of light in. This is the original glass. Some of it looks kind of wavy. From what I understand, glass is like slowly moving over hundreds of years. So it's like that movement that you kind of see that makes it look wavy. Over here, it's kind of interesting. This shows how the walls were made. So nowadays, when we build our homes, we usually have wallboard or drywall, as it's known, but they didn't have that back then. So again, they used that wood, that resource we talked about that was plenty available. They would have to chop the wood into little strips and line them all up here, and then they would mix their plaster, fill the wood with plaster, let it dry, and then paint it, and that would become their wallboard. So a very different way, even though it looks just like our regular drywall and wallboard, it's not made that way. Again, we talked about the wood being available. We just refinished the floor in this, so it looks brand new and beautiful, but it is the original wood floor, and the pews are also made out of wood. Even though they're painted white, they're made out of wood. So again, they were using the resources that they had. Downstairs, we do have an area where brides can get ready. There are bathrooms down there. There's a kitchen. So for the people that do have weddings here, they do have plumbing and electricity, so they have all the amenities you need to get ready as a bride. And also, we're very proud, I mentioned our brick, we're very proud of our new brick walkway that was completed last summer. And that really helps too for the people who decide to have weddings here, because it used to just be a muddy lane, and you can imagine the bridal gowns getting all dirty, and now it's just such a cleaner, really nicer atmosphere for them.